Fantrax Fantasy Football Mailbag episode. Let's get it. Rest of season, who scores more points? Joshua Palmer or Quentin Johnston? Great question, as Mike Williams unfortunately tore his ACL. Palmer was a third-round draft pick back in 2021. Johnston in this year's draft was a first-round draft pick. This season, the first 3 weeks, Johnston. Week 1, 27% of the snaps, 3 targets. Week 2, 15% of the snaps, 2 targets. And Week 3, 24% of the snaps and 3 targets. Joshua Palmer, 64% of the snaps in Week 1 with 1 target, 54% of the snaps in Week 2 with 5 targets, and then 61% of the snaps in Week 3 with 7 targets. So right now it's clear that Joshua Palmer has been playing a lot more percent of the snaps than Quentin Johnston, and he's being targeted more. So when we're looking at these two guys, who steps up immediately, I think it's Joshua Palmer, who has had 9 games of 13-plus fantasy points the last 2 seasons prior. 107 targets back in 2022, 8 career touchdowns for the Chargers. So I think right now it's Joshua Palmer who will step up. I think Quentin Johnston, though, is a good stash and somebody who could take off, but maybe later on in the season. All right, quick question. Tank, Madison, White, and Brian Robinson start 2 in flex. I think it's Tank Dell over Tank Bigsby, so I'm going to talk about Tank Dell. So Tank Dell plays the Pittsburgh Steelers. 17 targets the last 2 games, 72 and then 145 receiving yards, 20.71 yards per catch last week. Dell came in talking about how him and Stroud had communication during the draft and that Stroud vouched for him. I think right now he is the hot hand, scoring 20-plus fantasy points back-to-back weeks. Madison faces Carolina. Carolina allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs. KW the 3rd just scored 2 touchdowns on them last week. Bijan and Algier combined for 3 total touchdowns against them in Week 1. Cam Akers, I think, will be playing, but it's going to be his first game suiting up. Rachaad White gets the Saints. It's a tougher matchup, but he's had 19, 22, and 17 touches, playing above 70% of the snaps in all games. And then Brian Robinson versus the Eagles. It's the worst running back matchup for fantasy. The first 2 weeks, he was pretty good, but he scored touchdowns. That helps. Last week, when trailing Buffalo, he played just 37% of the snaps. So if we're looking at everything here, I think I'm sitting Brian Robinson for sure because, again, bad matchup. And when Washington was trailing last week, which I think they will against the Eagles this week, he didn't play a ton. Tank for sure. Tank Dell is going to be in your starting spot here. Then I think you juggle Madison and White. I think White has more solidified touches. I think Madison has a better matchup, so that's what you're going to juggle here. Sit 1, James Cook, Mostert, Kyren, KW9, full PPR. So James Cook, back-to-back top 20 performances. He had 123 and 98 rushing yards, which is good. The last 2 weeks, Miami, who he faces, is a top 10 fantasy matchup for running backs. Raheem Mostert, 121 and 82 rushing yards the last 2 weeks, 7 touchdowns in 3 games. I don't care about his matchup, and I know the rookie went off in that system last week, but Mostert has actually been very good. Kyren Williams opened up the first 2 games with top 10 performances. The last 2 weeks, 95% and then 100% of the snaps played with 17 targets in those 2 games, 4 touchdowns on the year. Walker has had back-to-back games with 2 touchdowns. First 2 weeks above 60% of the snaps. He faces the Giants, who are the 6th best matchup for running backs in fantasy football. I think I'm sitting Kyren Williams here out of this group. He faces the Colts, who are the toughest matchup for running backs in comparison to the rest of these guys. I do respect what he's doing. I know there's been some coach speak about getting some other guys touches because he's on the field too much. But when we're looking at maybe talent here and the upside in the rushing department, I think other guys here have a step above Kyren Williams. Who will lead the Bears in rushing this week? So Deonta Foreman played Week 1. I want to mention him. He had 7 touches at 28% of the snaps, and then he was a healthy scratch both Weeks 2 and 3. Here's the numbers. So if you want to talk about game script or efficiency, I'm just going to give you the straight numbers. Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson, the rookie. Herbert this season, 23 carries to Roschon Johnson, 17. And then Herbert, 93 to Johnson's 90 rushing yards. Roschon Johnson has a rushing touchdown. Khalil Herbert does not. Roschon leads Herbert in total targets just by 1, 11 to 10. In catches, though, Roschon, 10 catches, Herbert, 6. Here's how the snaps have gone, the snap percentages for Khalil Herbert and then Roschon Johnson. So Herbert, 36%, 60%, 55%. Roschon Johnson, 39%, 42%, and 45%. Last week, Roschon Johnson had 10 touches to Khalil Herbert's 9. So it's a true committee when we're looking strictly at the running backs here. I do believe that Roschon Johnson ends up finishing the season as the lead back. I'm not a Herbert hater by any means. I'm a Bears fan myself. I do just think that Roschon Johnson has the build of a starting running back, and he's impressed in a short window as a rookie so far. So I do believe that his role continues to increase. We've seen the last few weeks his snap percentage increase. So between these two guys, I think it's Roschon, but I don't know if the question necessarily is focused on running backs, and when you have two running backs splitting touches right now, I think the answer to this question to who might lead the Bears in rushing this week is Justin Fields. I'm hoping that Chicago gears the playbook around Justin Fields and designs more runs for their quarterback that led all quarterbacks last year in rushing yards. So to answer this question, I do believe against the Broncos this week that Justin Fields is the lead rusher for the Chicago Bears. Be sure to follow us on all socials here at Fantrax and drop your fantasy football questions next week to be featured on the show.